5. Back in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, Paul introduced the subject of Christian submitting to one another. In the verse as seen on the screen, it reads, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." And Paul describes in this verse and other verses in Ephesians what submission looks like in our day-to-day existence. And then he explains how we are supposed to submit in our everyday relationships. Paul starts with the closest relationship that we will have, and that's the relationship between a husband and a wife in a marriage. And he describes that really as a balanced relationship of mutual submission between the husband and the wife. Paul then moves over to the next closest relationship we have, and that is a parent and a child. The submission in the parent and child relationship is less balanced. Children are to obey their parents, but the parents are to submit to God and then to the children's needs. In Ephesians chapter 6, however, our lesson for today, Paul addresses submission in the most unbalanced of all relationships, that of a master and a slave. Slavery was a common part of the culture of Paul's day, and so Paul used the language that the people he was speaking to would understand. And now none of us here are old enough to have been around during slavery. And so our first reaction to hearing a text like this might be that Paul isn't really addressing work at all. So why would you name your title of your message, Take This Job and Love It? We would say when we hear this text that Paul is here writing about relationship between a master and a slave. But before we make those conclusions, I think we need to look at the nature of slavery in Greco-Roman period time that Paul lived in. Most of us, as I said earlier, weren't around during the time of slavery in America, and most of what we know about the institution of slavery comes from our study of slavery in the United States, where beginning in the 15th century, between 10 and 12 million Africans were purchased or kidnapped by Europeans and sold or traded as commodity. During this time, forts were built that served as trading posts for Europeans, and European sailors seeking riches brought alcohol and cloth and guns and other goods that used at these ports to trade them for human beings. On my visit to West Africa in Ghana, I happened to visit one of the castles where slaves were held. It was an amazing structure. This human cargo or slaves were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean. The Middle Passage is what it's called. And they were transported under very cruel, inhumane, harsh, and deadly conditions. A typical Atlantic crossing took 60 to 90 days, but some lasted as much as 4 months. The purchased slaves were often treated like cattle during the crossing, and on the slave ships, they were stuffed like sardines between decks in places too low to stand. Upon arrival in the New World, the slaves were sold to owners or masters who made them work their crops as well as treated them in many inhumane ways. One conservative historian estimates that between 10 and 12 million men, women, and children were brought, sold, uprooted from their homes and their cultures and their families simply for the profit of other human beings. It is also estimated that because of the poor living condition on the boats that they were being transported, these slaves, at least 2 million of them, died en route to the New World. It's not known exactly how many actually died during slavery or upon arriving in the New World. Slavery, that's slavery in America. Slavery in the Greco-Roman period, however, was much different. Historians estimate that in the Roman Empire at the time of Paul, there might have been 60 million slaves. Somewhere between 1/3 or 1/2 of the population lived in some form of servitude. In some areas in Asia Minor, slave people actually outnumbered free men and women. Initially, most enslavement resulted from the conquest in war. And they were the losers or the prisoners of war were forced into slavery by the Greeks and then later by the Romans. Others became slaves as a result of incurring a debt that they had. I have a debt that I owe you and I cannot repay your debt, so I have to work off the cost of that debt as a slave. Jesus actually referred to this kind of slavery in several of his parables. But there were others who were also born into slavery. Although some forms of slavery, such as rowing a ship or working in a mine, did involve poor working conditions and harsh treatment, that was not the normal situation for most slaves during the time of Paul. In fact, almost all labor was performed by slaves, even those tasks that we would consider to be desk jobs, or teachers and tutors and secretaries and personal advisors during the Greco-Roman period, time of Paul, were all performed by slaves. And most slaves during this time were treated as human beings, and in some cases even treated as members of the master's household. Unlike the slavery that existed in America, there were laws in the Greco-Roman period and the Greco-Roman world at that time that required masters to provide slaves with food and with clothing and with shelter. And in many cases, slaves could even earn enough money to purchase their freedom. So Paul mentions that practice in 1 Corinthians. And although the masters during this period had absolute authority over the slaves, there were laws which punished masters if they mistreated a slave. Now, there are still places in our world today where slavery and human trafficking exists. But thanks be to God and the tireless work of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party at that time and others, the institution of slavery has been outlawed in our culture and in our nation. And so when we read a text like this, you can't just jump over that and go to the other parts. You got to deal with it. And when we read a text like this, it's easy for us to say, it's not applying to me. But the closest relationship that we can draw from this slave-master relationship in our day is the relationship of the employer and the employee. And in this text, Paul really shares some practical instructions and excellent principles that we can learn when we look at that boss-worker relationship on our job, wherever we work, or when we were working if we are retired. Tomorrow, as a nation, we will be celebrating Labor Day. The slide will show you there. And of all of the holidays that we celebrate in America, Labor Day is the most perplexing for me. One writer described Labor Day as you see on the screen, a celebration of American workers' freedoms and rights. Now, if that quote is true, shouldn't we labor on Labor Day? But how many signs like the next slide will we see when we go around tomorrow? Imagine me going to my boss, Pastor Mark, the Friday before Labor Day and saying, you know, Mark, for the joy of working, I am going to work on Labor Day. None of us would do that. Not even me. We don't want to labor on Labor Day, but we do expect to get paid. And I wonder what that says about our dedication to the celebration of labor. Let me ask you a few questions. And don't answer them, especially if your boss is sitting next to you. And if you are retired, think about the time when you were working and answer these questions to yourself. Do you really like your job? Or did you really like your job? Do you or did you look forward to going back to work on Monday mornings because you really missed your boss? Do you or did you miss your fellow co-workers so much that you could hardly wait to get back to work to see how they were doing? According to a survey a few years ago, about 35% of Americans answered yes to those three questions. The survey revealed that 65% of Americans were unhappy with their jobs, and many go to work simply because they have no other choice. As the quote on the screen says, I owe, so off to work I go. Maybe those feelings were the inspiration behind the popular 1970 song by a well-known country singer. Now, I don't listen to a lot of country music. I don't have anything against country music, but I don't listen to a lot of country music. But I do like George Strait. His song, All My Exes Live in Texas. I don't have any exes that live in Texas. And in 1977, when many of you were much younger, some of us here, some were not born, and I was a wee little child, Donald Eugene Lythe, or Johnny Paycheck as he's known on the stage, recorded a hit single that apparently hit a nerve with people. And the song actually became his bestseller and inspired a movie with the same name and sold over 2 million copies. You know the name of the song. Take This Job. Can we say that in church? Now, contrary to the survey, and even contrary to the words or the title of that popular song, the Bible declares that work was ordained by God. In the first book of the Bible, Genesis, God worked and God rested, modeling for us how we should live our lives, work and rest. Work was ordained by God. The Bible also teaches that work is not a punishment. But in Ecclesiastes 2 and 24 and 25, as you see on the screen, it reads, there is nothing better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. So if work or labor was inspired by God, and Labor Day is a celebration, as you see on the screen, of Americans, workers' freedoms and rights, what rights do we have as workers? You see, as a nation, we're concerned or consumed sometimes with our rights. On the screen, the Bill of Rights. Our earliest settlers left Europe to be free to exercise their rights from the state church and for the right to worship as they chose. Our fundamental rights have always been important to us as Americans, and we are not afraid to demand our rights. We demand our political rights, our economic rights, our medical rights, our rights to school, our rights at church, our rights even at home. I used to watch a television show about an African-American family called Everybody Hates Chris. It's kind of a play on the word, if for those of you who have seen the show Everybody Loves Raymond, so they came up with Everybody Hates Chris. And one day, Chris, the oldest son in the family, came home from school after having a conversation with one of his friends at school. And his friend asked him, "Hey, Chris, do you get allowance?" And Chris said, "No." And his friend said, "That's your right as a child to get allowance." So Chris decided to go home and have a conversation with his parents about this right that has been denied him. And at the supper table, Chris looks at his mom and dad and said, "Mom and Dad, I think I need to talk to you about getting allowance." His mom looked at his dad, and for a brief moment there was silence, after which the father said, "You want to talk to me about getting allowance? I allow you to sleep in this house. I allow you to eat my food, use my electricity, watch my television, wear the clothes that I bought you. Why should I give you allowance when I'm already paying for everything that you have?" You see, we are passionate about our rights in America, and the place we seem to demand those rights the most is at work. And so for just the few minutes that I have left, I want to leave you with 4 brief rights that I want you to demand in your life, on your job, in your home, in your community, and in this church. I want you to demand these rights, these 4 brief rights. These are rights that I believe, when demanded and when granted and when lived out, will move us from take this job and shove it to take this job and love it. Right number 1 is the right heart. And Paul talks about this in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. Notice in the text that Paul does not say that the slave should be submitted to the master or the employee to the employer. The only submission that Paul talks about in this text is the slave and the master, the employee and the employer being submitted to God. In other words, our hearts need to be in the right place. And Paul wants us to understand that it is God who allows us to do the work that we do. And when we do that work, we don't do it to impress others. We don't do it to impress our boss. We don't do it to impress our teachers. But we do the work that we do to impress God. You see, if we work only to impress the boss, our parents, our teachers, we will lose heart. We will lose the desire when we don't get the recognition that we think we earned. We will lose heart and we will lose desire when we don't get the promotion that we feel we deserve. We will lose heart and we will lose desire when we don't get the grade that we expected. And so Paul tells us to do our work not for eye service, not because someone is watching us or to please other human beings, not for a promotion, not for the next office up or the next position up, but we have to do our work with the motivation of having the right heart. And when we do our work that way, when we use our God-given ability to the best of our ability, then our work becomes a service to God. So the first heart that I want us to demand is the right heart. The second right, rather, that I want us to look at is the right attitude. The right attitude. And Paul talks about this in the 7th verse of our text. And here Paul brings out the idea of doing our work as a service to the Lord and not to people. But this time, Paul adds the idea of doing that work with goodwill. In the Greek, the word goodwill is really one word, and it carries with it the idea of doing your work with zeal, doing your work with eagerness, doing our service enthusiastically, with a whole heart. It's an attitude word. Have you ever met people who never have a positive attitude? Don't raise your hand, because the person might be behind you. Have you ever met people like that? That always have a bad attitude. They remind me of the Winnie the Pooh character, Eeyore. Gloomy. I mean, always gloomy. I'm not talking about someone who's ill or someone who's going through a difficult time. We all have those spaces in our life. So I'm not talking about a temporary situation where someone is really affected by outside forces that they can't control. I'm just talking about, it just seems like it's their nature. Always gloomy, always grumpy, always miserable. For Eeyore, if the sun was shining, it shined too hot. If it rained, it got too wet. He could always find a dark cloud inside of every silver lining. Chuck Swindoll says this in his famous quote: "The longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude on life. Attitude to me is more important than facts. It's more important than the past, than education, than money, than circumstances, than failures, than success, than what other people think or say or do. It is more important than appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, a home. The remarkable thing is we have a choice, even every day, regarding the attitude we will embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in a certain way. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play on the one thing we have, and that is our attitude. I am convinced," he continues on and says, "that life is 10% of what happens to me and 90% of how I react to it." And so it is with you. We're in charge of our attitude. And Paul says, a right attitude is an attitude unto the Lord and not to human beings. Our attitude at work, our attitude at home, our attitude in service reflects Christ, and our attitude affects those around us. Our attitude reflects Christ, and our attitude affects those around us. I don't want to be the kind of Christian who works and serves because I feel I have to. I don't want to be the kind of Christian who works and serves only because I feel I ought to. I don't even want to be the kind of Christian who works and serves because I feel I want to, because there might be days that I don't want to. But I want to be the kind of Christian who works and serves because Jesus Christ has captured my heart and I love him. So the second right that every Christian should fight for is the right attitude. The third right that we should demand in our life is a right perspective. Paul begins verse 9 with these words, "Master, do the same." In other words, God expects the boss to have the same heart as the worker. A heart that recognizes that God is the one who puts that person in that position. So if I'm a boss, it means that God expects me to have the same positive, enthusiastic, encouraging attitude that I anticipate the worker having. But how can we do that? If you're a worker, if you're a student, if you're a boss, how can you have the right attitude and the right heart? The only way to have both of those is by having the right perspective. And Paul is saying no matter what our role, as workers, as boss, as students, as homemakers, as retirees, all of us have one ultimate boss. All of us are equally responsible and accountable to that one ultimate boss who is God. And that is the right perspective that Paul says we all need to have. And finally, the fourth perspective, or the fourth right that all of us need to have or fight for, is the right reward. The right reward. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warns his listeners then, and he warns each of us today about doing things to get recognition, doing things in order to receive an earthly award. Jesus begins in that sermon by talking about giving. He said, don't give just to be praised for it or to be praised by others. He said, for if you do that, that's all you get. Then he moves on to prayer, and he says, don't pray or use your ability to pray as an opportunity for people to recognize how great you are, how eloquent you are, what a prayer warrior you are, because if you do that, that's all you get. And then he goes on to fasting, and he said, don't go through this spiritual discipline just that people will recognize how holy and how spiritual you are, because if you do, your reward is limited to some hunger pains, a headache, and maybe a loss of a few pounds. You see, all of us like to be praised. All of us like to be praised for a job well done. All of us want to be recognized. It's human nature. But Paul says that human praise and human recognition and human accolades and human awards should not be the only motivation for the work that we do. We shouldn't work simply to get a human award, a higher salary, a bigger office, employee of the month, student of the year, climb the corporate ladder. Because he says if we do that, there's something missing. You see, in the moment, all of those awards and all of those accolades and all of those prizes and trophies, they really seem invaluable, but I'm really amazed at how quickly they fade away. I'm closing with this story, but I got a text from my sister last week, and she said, Kenneth, when we moved, I took like 2 boxes of things that belonged to you, and I opened them the other day, and there were trophies that you had won from tennis tournaments in high school and college, and plaques and awards that you had received on the speech and debate team, and what do you want me to do with them? And I said, you can throw them away. Don't get me wrong. We can and should be happy for those things when they happen. But if that's all we're working for, if that's all we're living for, then we're in trouble. After receiving his Oscar award for his performance in The Training Day, my twin brother, Denzel Washington, said that his grandmother told him this quote. It's on the screen. Man awards, but God rewards. Man awards, but God rewards. You see, we're called to live, work, and serve not for an award, but for a reward that only God can give. I started my sermon with the words of a song, so it's only fitting that I end my sermon with the words of a song. This one is by a Jamaican reggae singer named Bob Marley. You might have heard of him. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up for your right, the right attitude, a right heart, a right perspective, and a right reward. Amen.